So welcome to another GAI Report on Digital Economy author interview. Today we have James Cooper with us to talk about his chapter on our upcoming report on the digital economy. James is an associate professor of law at the Antonin Scalia Law School, the director of the program on economics and privacy at the Law and Economics Center, and is recently back from the FTC, where he served as the deputy director for economic analysis in the Bureau of Consumer Protection from 2018 to 2019. James is writing in our report on the ever-growing intersection between privacy and antitrust law and how those two work together. So without putting words in his mouth, I'll let him go. So thank you for joining us today. And if you wouldn't mind giving us a quick overview of some of the major points in your chapter.
Yeah, thanks, Matt. It's fantastic to be here. This is an area of research that is, I have to say I'm kind of passionate about. And as you mentioned, I in my career before I got into academia, I spent a long time at the FTC doing a lot of competition work, and then later kind of merged into consumer protection work and getting interested in privacy and data security. So the intersection between the two has always been has been something that I've been really interested in. So it was great to get a chance to work on this chapter. I look forward to getting into some of the more details, but I just kind of a broad overview. What motivated this chapter, what motivated some of the research that I've been doing in this area is, you know, I think it's tempting when you look at the biggest firms in the economy that are kind of in the regulatory crosshairs, you know, whether it's Google or Facebook or Apple, you know, they're large firms, and especially they're large platforms. They maybe not Apple, but certainly Google and Facebook. You know, they live off consumer data. Or consumer data is certainly vital to what they do. Some of these firms, or both of them, have had some privacy issues. YouTube, you've recently signed a consent decree with the FTC, and with respect to COPPA, we've got Facebook. Of course, we know the Cambridge Analytica, and then both of them have had some other privacy issues going back. And so I think it's tempting when you look, well, these firms are large, they live off of consumer data, that maybe it's tempting to find a correlation there, to look and say, well, that maybe antitrust is something that we should use to address these issues. You often hear the phrase that data is the price we pay for this, and while there may be, it's a nice analogy, it's a nice soundbite, I think it's more complicated than that. And so what I wanted to do is kind of tease out some of these, unpack some of the assumptions underlying the idea that underlying the idea that privacy is the price you pay to use these firms, and therefore, if we think that they're taking too much data, perhaps antitrust is the issue, and to really unpack. And so what I hope this does is show that it's more complicated than that. So I walk through some of the complications of actually how we think through antitrust in the context of platform, and rather than looking sort of traditional antitrust, say a merger where two firms are close competitors, they get together and we're worried that price is going to go up and output's going to go down, that we're more concerned about, not about price or output, we're concerned about privacy, and using antitrust as a tool to go about privacy. So the paper goes through some, you know, different complications that arise when you try to tackle the privacy problem with antitrust. So, you know, that's kind of the big picture, and I look forward to maybe going through some of the finer points of it.
Yeah, with trying to work privacy into the antitrust analysis, I think you make a helpful distinction at the beginning where privacy, either you can treat privacy as a direct goal of competition law or privacy as a dimension of competition, with the first arguing that improving privacy on its own should be a focus of competition law, and the second arguing that privacy kind of works into this overall effects analysis where you treat privacy almost as akin to quality, but there are again being some distinctions between the two that we'll talk about in a little bit. So I guess what are the advantages to either one of these approaches, and what are some of the disadvantages that come with either?
Well, yeah, so you're absolutely right. I mean, one of the kind of, you have to break the think, well, should we use antitrust to directly go after privacy? So let's say that two firms are merging. There's zero market overlap. They're completely complementary products or unrelated products. And under any type of antitrust analysis, you wouldn't find a problem. But let's say that there's a concern that one of the parties, if you merge the two data sets together, you would somehow reduce privacy. And it's in the context of a merger. So there could be there's a temptation, and it's been done in the so the content, you go back to the Google DoubleClick merger, you go back to Facebook Instagram or Facebook WhatsApp, and there's this Google Nest is another example. So where there may not be an antitrust problem, but there is at least a call on the outside to say, well, we don't care if there's a traditional antitrust problem. We think that this is a privacy problem. So let's go after, say that, well, these two firms getting together will reduce privacy, and that's enough. Now, the antitrust has been pretty, the Supreme Court and the way antitrust laws have evolved have been pretty clear that unless the goal of antitrust is competition and not to go after other societal ills. And National Society of Professional Engineers is probably the clearest statement of that, where engineers got together and set up a code of ethics that essentially that forbid competitive bidding, and the idea was that, well, if you bid, competitive bidding would lead to too low of quality, and bridges would fall down, buildings would fall down, quality would not be high enough. And the Supreme Court said, look, we care about bridges and we care about quality, but what the antitrust laws are about, not about the quality of engineering products. Antitrust laws are about competition, and you all are colluding to say let's not bid, and so these other things are outside of the realm. So this is the idea of, so it would seem that National Society of Professional Engineers and other statements of similar statements of that general idea would foreclose the idea of just using the antitrust laws to directly go after privacy. All right, they're about competition. That's to be distinguished from a more viable theory, is where you can say there are two firms and they're competing, and somehow, whether it is a merger, whether it is some kind of other joint venture, or some sort of horizontal conduct, per se illegal conduct, but the reduction in competition between the firms leads to a reduction in privacy. So the idea that privacy is a dimension of competition, okay, that privacy is and that's to be, again, distinguished from the idea of that here are two firms, they're not competing at all, they're getting together. Maybe them getting together does raise a privacy problem, but that's not a goal of antitrust just because it seems to happen in the context of a merger, of a transaction. However, say there are two firms that there's evidence that are that they compete fiercely on privacy, and that's the one dimension they compete on, and then they get together and somehow they restrict competition, whether they enter into a per se legal agreement or whether they enter into try to merge. That's a different animal, and I think that's a viable antitrust theory there. And that's, again, to be distinguished from saying that we're just going to use antitrust to go after any privacy problem we see out there.
Yeah. So going using, I guess, antitrust as an element, or not antitrust, privacy as an element of antitrust enforcement as opposed to a goal in and of itself, then the rest of the chapter kind of walks through how you would implement that into traditional antitrust enforcement and what issues might arise from trying to work privacy into this framework. So I think it makes sense to probably work through a couple different examples of that. But first, I want to ask how privacy, and you kind of talked about this, but to flesh it out a little more, how privacy would come up in a theory of harm in either the government's case or a private party's case.
Yeah, good question. Now, I think again, and this is interesting because it's sort of a, in theory, could this come up? This is one of the ideas is in theory, you could imagine, say, I think the archetypal example would be two, as I mentioned before, two firms, they compete fiercely on privacy. All the documents show that they compete on privacy, and you actually have good data that suggests that these two firms, the consumers are choosing among these firms based on their privacy policies. And that would be in the context of a merger. And I think maybe that's the most, at least that's the most talked about way that this could come up. You see this, again, I mentioned before, the Google DoubleClick merger back in, I believe it was 2008, where that was really the first time that privacy and antitrust started to meet. Google was buying DoubleClick for their ad serving business, and there were no traditional antitrust concerns. The way the FTC analyzed this was that actually they were Google and DoubleClick were more complements in the ad serving ecosystem, but there were their Commissioner Harbour at the time issued a fairly influential dissent saying that, well, you should look at privacy and define privacy, something called a privacy market. Now that we don't necessarily need to go into whether looking at a market for privacy, defining privacy markets, really, if that's conceptually the correct way to go about it. But it really started started the ball rolling as far as thinking about privacy in the context of merger. We have two firms that deal with data. We're dealing with this is all about targeting ads and cookies and things like that, the things that drive a lot of privacy policy discussions, right? And this was in the so I think that the merger setting is maybe the most viable. You see it also show up in it was raised a little bit. I mentioned Google and I mentioned Facebook and WhatsApp before. It was raised at least externally. People had wanted that to be an issue, and also Facebook and Instagram, leaving aside the potential competition issues that were potentially raised in that. And now still many years later, people are still talking about that. But there's also an urge to look at privacy as a potential harm that was going to come out of these mergers. And in none of the instances did the FTC bite. Also, there have been a couple of mergers in the EU. I think of Microsoft and LinkedIn as one, where privacy was also something that that was on the table potentially. Again, the agencies said, yeah, in theory, we could imagine it. It just isn't here, right? And so I think that that's probably the most likely context it would come up in. It doesn't mean that it couldn't come up in other contexts. Again, you could imagine finding two firms who compete, query whether if DuckDuckGo and Google, DuckDuckGo, who makes its living, it's the privacy search engine, and we're the anti-Google. Clearly that's how it's marketing itself. And if Google and DuckDuckGo were to enter into some kind of illegal agreement to not compete on privacy anymore, okay, that would be the kind of thing where you can imagine it showing up again. And then also, maybe we'll talk about this a little bit later. There's the unilateral context where it could show up, a Section 2. You see now, at least in the press reports, you hear about the agencies potentially thinking about suing Facebook and Google under various antitrust theories. Query the extent to which privacy comes up in either one of those, the idea being that somehow unilateral conduct, and this is important, again, I already sort of mentioned this, is that it's quite a different animal to say that, okay, well, Facebook has become a large firm and now they're taking a lot of data. So let's say that the privacy is an antitrust problem. Well, that isn't really you need to have an anti-competitive theory. You need to have something right there. It's pretty much black letter antitrust law that a lawful monopolist can charge whatever price they want to. And if we're going to equate data to price or privacy to quality, if Facebook is a dominant firm and they decide they want to extract more data, that's not really an antitrust issue. Where it could in a unilateral conduct case, a Section 2 case, where you could find an underlying anti-competitive conduct that then reduced the competitive constraints on Facebook, which then allowed it to enjoy the fruits of its lack of competition due to, through enhanced privacy. Somehow it foreclosed the social media market. It foreclosed potential competitors with better privacy from the social media market, which then meant that they could have less privacy. I mean, again, that would be the type of theory that you could imagine. And again, query whether we'll find out in the coming weeks or months whether any of these type of theories underlie whatever case FTC or DOJ may bring against one of these companies.
Yeah, that's I think continuing on the unilateral conduct front, because there is kind of a distinction in there that you mentioned where being big and collecting data being a harm on its own, or the traditional conduct under Section 2 in the US. So the Bundeskartellamt in Germany had seemingly what would fit under the first prong of that against Facebook last year. And then so kind of building off of that case, then in the US, what would be required to show conduct under Section 2 in a privacy harm type case?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. So the Bundeskartellamt case is, that I don't think that you could bring that case in the U.S. Again, maybe we'll find out. It's interesting in the sense it's that as I read the theory of the case is that Facebook is a dominant firm, and as a dominant firm, they're able to extract additional data from consumers, and that is not on the platform, but through its ad net. They're tracking off the Facebook platform on even off users through like buttons, through their ad network, through various means. And that the fact that you have to consent to all of those means in order to use the platform, that is taking too much data. Now, again, if that's just extracting too high of a price in the U.S., that's not really going to be an issue. Where the Bundeskartellamt goes with this is to say that by extracting that data, that kind of erects a barrier to entry through indirect network effects, for lack of a better word. So they're getting more consumer data, they're becoming a better platform, they're attracting more consumers, they're better for advertisers, and that entrenches their dominance, which then allows them to extract even more data, and so on and so on. You see some sort of flavor of that theory in a lot of antitrust theories, whether it's for the large tech platforms that live on data. You hear similar forms of that. So one of the again, I'm not really sure if how you would make that theory work in the United States. It's not to say that it would rely on this indirect network. Gathering more data equals, gives rise to a barrier to entry. But it's interesting because the barrier to entry, at least if you read the Bundeskartellamt case, or at least the way I read it, is actually because it's becoming a better platform, right? And so I've collected your data. Now I become more attractive. I have more people on the platform, and I'm getting a more effective advertiser. So it's not the normal anti-competitive story where Q goes down, quantity goes down. That's what we care about. That's why we care about monopoly. That's why we have the antitrust laws, is because of deadweight loss, right? I mean, that's the problem, is that the monopolist restricts output. This doesn't seem to be an output restricting argument. And unless there is some evidence on the advertising side that somehow it's allowing them, but this doesn't seem to be the theory there. So, I mean, you could imagine perhaps a theory on the advertising side that you're then exerting market power on the advertising side and reducing output. But I think it's be a very hard case to bring in the U.S. One area where there has been there's been some academic writing and some policy writing. I think it may have also been mentioned in the UK's Competition Market Authority report on digital markets that came out this summer. The idea, the extent to which deception that, Facebook, as I mentioned early on in this in our interview here, Facebook has been in various privacy trouble at the FTC. I mean, they settled consent back in 2011, which led to the gigantic fine, the $5 billion fine for Cambridge Analytica. So you've got a history of say Facebook and Google having settled consent decrees, settled cases with the FTC based on deception with respect to their privacy policy. You also have assorted private claims around the same type of alleged conduct. And so there have been some theories put out there that potentially deception could be the basis for an antitrust claim. And there is some precedent for deception making an antitrust claim. I go into this in much more detail in the chapter. A lot of that is distinguishable, deception to a government agency in order to get a patent, or, the FTC brought a series of cases in the early 2000s dealing with brand name drugs trying to thwart generic entry through lying to the FDA about their patents on what's called the Orange Book, so they could stop generic entry. So you're lying to an agency, or you're lying to a standard setting body, okay, that has the ability to keep someone out of the market. Here, it's different. You could imagine, you're lying to a consumer about your privacy policies, and so that's I think a different animal. I mean, maybe you move the market a little bit in your direction, but as much as there are a lot of hurdles, and I think the antitrust laws have been understandably and probably correctly skeptical about allowing just sort of deception of consumers that maybe shift sales from one to another to actually form the basis for antitrust. Because what you need is, number one, a really large shift. It's got to be a causal relationship between the lie and your dominance, essentially. And so the lie has to be so much that it drives everyone to your platform. And the law that driving to your platform has to be so durable that the fact that, you lied for so long that everyone came over, and now once the lie has been shown to be true, no one's going back to the competing platform because they're all gone. So again, it's not to say that these anti-competitive theories are, there's no theoretical reason they couldn't exist. It just would be really difficult to make that out.
Yeah. So underlying all of these theories of harm is the idea that people really do care about privacy, which colloquially does seem to be the case. But in the research, and as you point out in your chapter, there seems to be this privacy paradox between the stated preference for more privacy and revealed behavior showing that privacy maybe doesn't matter that much. So what does this kind of maybe lack of care about privacy and revealed preferences show us about the potential for any of these harms we talked about to come about, and what incentive does this paradox give to firms to set their privacy policies?
Yeah, and that's a good question. So, underlying the idea, whether the analogy is privacy to quality or whether it's data to price, they're really equivalent. You can say that data is the price I pay in order to enjoy this platform for free, or you can say that that more privacy equals more quality, less privacy equals lower quality. However you want to work it out, they're essentially equivalent. Now, underlying that idea is kind of a built-in assumption is that privacy is this core thing that moves consumers. Now, when we know that price is, the antitrust agencies, I think, correctly focus on price because most competing competitors, when you get a merger in the door, you're going to look at price because you assume that they're going to compete on price because consumers care about price. That's probably the number one thing they care about in most markets. In a lot of these markets, there's no price. You have, if we're talking about large tech platforms, we're mostly talking about free stuff. Not all the time, but we're talking about we're talking about free stuff. So I think, again, it's tempting to say, oh, well, it's their take data's the price. So what we're going to do is say we'll assume that they compete on privacy or the amount of data they take. And then if that we're worried about, that the limitation of that, and that kind of assumes that that consumers will be moved by that. And what you talked about is the privacy paradox, is this inconsistency between stated preference and revealed preference for privacy. So you do a survey and you can see them. There are a million surveys out there, whether it's Pew or Gallup or, whoever, that you care about privacy. 99% say, I care deeply about privacy. Or how is privacy important to you? Do you feel like your data is out of control? There are a lot of surveys and they're out there. And I don't think I don't think people are lying. I think they do care about privacy. But when you make people make a choice, we don't see in the real world, we see opt-out rates from cookies at less than 1%. There's a paper by Garrett Johnson and a couple of his co-authors recently published, and I think in Marketing Science, that documents, it's got really good data on from an ad network, and opt-out rates where you can opt from ad choices is minuscule. So there are tools out there, and it's not just that. There are a lot of tools people could use, and then you think of, even with, say, the Cambridge Analytica and other, what happened to the Facebook user base. There was maybe, if you look at the data, and I haven't studied it in depth, but there may have been a little blip, but it's not like it's really slowed down. It's not as if people just abandoned the platform. And it was in the news, it was everywhere. There was a movement, get off of Facebook, boycott Facebook. Those are just two examples. There are myriad examples. DuckDuckGo has still less than, I think, I want to say they're less than 1% of search. I could be wrong. Don't quote me on that, though this is being recorded, so I guess I will be quoted. But it's still minuscule, and that's after Super Bowl advertising, tons of advertising. They're the privacy, right? And what it's to say is that privacy doesn't seem to move the needle. And I just add one other thing. We look at that in the real world. There have been a lot of experimental studies, and there have been some quasi-field experiments on this. And almost without an exception, they all find that the willingness to pay for additional privacy is really small. That people are just really willing to trade data for access to free stuff. And that's just what it is. Now, the counter to that, you may say, well, yeah, but privacy is complicated. It's contextual. These privacy policies that firms have or there are lots of legalese, and it's buried and people don't really understand it, or and firms can't credibly commit to do it, to keep being good stewards of data, because once they have it, how can you monitor it and make sure? So there are a lot of counters to that, and that may be all true. And the point here is not to resolve the privacy paradox. I mean, one resolution of it is it's not a paradox. It's just rational choice, because stated preferences when you're doing it without having to actually make any trade-offs. Revealed preferences when you have to put your money where your mouth is, so to speak. And it's not surprising. And there are other instances where organic food is one where you actually see a very similar thing. People love the idea of organic foods, but then when you look at the market shares of organic foods, they don't match up how many people say, because you actually have to trade off the higher price for the organic food. You see the same thing here potentially. That's one explanation. The other explanation could be the asymmetric information problem I just told you about. Consumers don't get it. But it doesn't matter from an antitrust perspective. If we're trying to think about, does privacy move the market, whether it doesn't move the market because I mean, more technically, it seems that the elasticity of demand with respect to privacy is really low. And so the question is it really low because of rational consumers acting rationally? Or is it really low because understanding firms' privacy choices is just an almost insurmountable task? You know, regardless of which one it is, it doesn't move the needle. So the idea that we just need to get competition in this market and then we'll have lots of privacy, it doesn't seem, this doesn't seem to be the case. I mean, the empirics don't seem to spell this out. You know, it could work the other way. You know, if this is driven by information problems that, you know, that consumers don't understand this, so they expect the worst from firms. So firms can't credibly commit saying, look, I promise you, I'm not going to do anything with your data, but a rational consumer will say, I can't trust you because I can't monitor you because this is too complicated. And you end up in kind of a lemons market type of equilibrium. That's possible. The answer there is more consumer protection, not competition. Yeah. The amount of competition is going to drive this. Maybe you need, you know, and this is something the FTC's tried to do a lot of work on, and others, you know, and maybe you need more disclosure. And that's another issue, whether actually more disclosure works or not. Amri bin Shahar has done some good work in this area that suggests maybe not. You know, so maybe it's about disclosures. Maybe it's just also the other thing the FTC does, which is valuable, I think, is holding firms to their privacy promises. So if you make a promise, you can't renege on it, or you'll be in trouble, as both Google and Facebook have found out. So, you know, maybe that's where consumer protection has a role to play in helping facilitate a market, but it's not if we think there's too little privacy in a market, it doesn't appear that competition is the thing that is missing. It's like, oh, if we just had competition, because it doesn't seem at this point that privacy is really nearly as germane to competition as other dimensions in this space. So, you know, that's kind of how I think about the privacy, what the privacy paradox has to say about the interface between privacy and competition law.
Yeah. So I think next you mentioned that subjectivity is a potentially thorny issue in incorporating privacy into antitrust. I'm wondering if you can expand on that.
Yeah, well, so, you know, when you think about having to decide, looking at a merger and thinking, okay, well, you know, these two firms are merging, it's easy, and it's actually, I wouldn't say it's easy. In a lot of cases, you know, if you're reviewing a merger, you at least have price and quantity as a metric, and everyone agrees on that. You know, you have your SNP test, and you look, is it, you know, 5% non-transitory increase in price, right? And at least you have some metrics. You know, people can disagree on the methodology, can disagree on the data and how it's being analyzed. But you have a metric you can look at and you can measure objectively. What are we going to predict is going to happen to price? And maybe you have a natural experiment like, you know, in the Staples Office Depot case, or, you know, where you can actually look and you can see what has happened and you can measure it and you can have data. And again, you can argue about the econometrics and things like that, but you know what you're measuring, you know where the goalposts are. Mm-hmm. If you get into privacy and saying, well, we're going to think about blocking a merger based on what we think that they're going to unduly reduce privacy, you know, how do you define what is the analog to a significant reduction in price in the terms of privacy? And imagine whether it's the antitrust division, AAG, looking at trying to figure out, that to block a merger, or 5 commissioners, some of whom will say, yeah, well, our data suggests they compete on privacy, and if they get together, they're going to take they're going to take more data. So I think that means a significant reduction in competition that's going to harm consumers. Where maybe another would say, no, that's not gonna be any big deal because they're just taking browsing data, and I don't think that's a big deal, right? And what I'm saying is that subjectivity, and when you introduce subjectivity into any regulatory domain, that's really uncertainty, because here in this case you don't really even know where it's going to be a subjective determination. What are 3 out of 5 commissioners going to think is a significant reduction in privacy, significant enough to block a merger, or significant enough to bring a Section 1 or Section 2 case? That is going to make it really hard for me as antitrust counsel, or as someone on, a general counsel at a firm or decision maker at a firm, to think when you're apprising the antitrust risks of a possible transaction. It makes it a lot harder. It makes it a lot harder. I mean, I know in my early days when I was a young associate at a large firm, and putting together mock-ups of, okay, what are the potential changes in HHIs for these mergers, and how have the agencies looked at them? I mean, yeah, there's a little bit of guesswork, and you don't really know what the agency is going to do, but at least you're looking at, you've got some kind of metric to look at that everyone agrees on. Another thing I would add to this that kind of adds to a complication that I discuss in the chapter, that adds to the, I think adds a bit to the subjectivity, is we talk about, the privacy. One of the things that I think that is important to realize is that if you're thinking about reductions in privacy, imagine, okay, we want to challenge this merger under the theory that they're going to reduce privacy, which is really the same as, say, reducing quality, right? They're going to get together. Well, I think it's one thing, it's slightly different in a very important way, that a reduction in privacy versus, say, a reduction in quality at another dimension, holding price constant. So you imagine the situation of 2 auto manufacturers merging, right? And they get together, and they're not going to raise price, but what they're going to do is they're say that the merger gives them market power, gives them some kind of and the ability to raise prices or reduce it, but they decide to take it out through reduced quality. So they hold the price constant, but they make the tires on the car worse, or the audio system worse, something. So I'm keeping the price at $30,000, but I'm giving you a set of tires and a stereo system that are not as good as we used to. So you're the automaker, your profits have gone up right away, because you've reduced your input cost. You're giving a worse stereo and worse tires. You're holding the price constant. Consumers are worse off. They're getting, if you think about a quality adjusted price, well, the quality adjusted price has gone up because you're getting a lower quality for the same price. Okay, so that would be the theory. And I think that you try to shoehorn this privacy in there, and you can say, okay, well, they're going to reduce privacy. Well, collecting more consumer data doesn't directly increase your bottom line, right? And what happens is, now I have a whole bunch of extra consumer data on my server. What am I going to do with it? I want to make money out of that. I'm going to monetize that. And the way that you're going to monetize this, often, if not almost all the time, is going to involve some type of consumer benefit for at least some people, right? For at least some people, they're going to enjoy. So you think about the easiest case of, I get together and we reduce privacy, and by that I mean I'm collecting a lot more data on my platform, or I've got a lot more I've got an ad network to do targeted ads, and I'm placing cookies on you to target ads. Well, that's a privacy invasion, and people may not like that, but I gather this data, and the data is for targeted ads. Well, there's a benefit there, right? At some point, right? Some people may enjoy that. It may create value enhancing exchanges if you find, it's giving information. Now, it's not to say that what complicates this makes it more complicated, is that it isn't, in order to enjoy higher profits from reduced privacy, you're going to have to do something with the data, and that something will involve benefits to some people almost always, right? That's why, and even if you take the data and you don't monetize it directly, but you just sell it to a data broker, well, a data broker, why do people buy data from data brokers? Again, to target, because at the end of the day, it's usually about either customization or selling something to somebody. Now, what their tastes for privacy are heterogeneous. There's a distribution. Tastes for the ultimate good or service that the platform is providing, that's heterogeneous too. And it's complicated. You've got to work out how the correlations between the demand for privacy, the demand for the good, and the benefits that are going to come out of the increased customization. Some people, it doesn't mean that it can never be net harmful to consumers. It just means it's more complicated because there are going to be a distribution of tastes and preferences for privacy and for customization, and they're going to be correlated in ways that we may not understand. So it's going to be complicated. I would put a plug out. Doug Smith and Dan O'Brien have an FTC working paper on this, and it's where they go through this and fairly complex economic model. But this is what they're talking about this notion of correlated consumer preferences, both for the improved quality of the underlying good from more data and for privacy reductions that comes from gathering more data. So.
Yeah. Got it. Well, and then, so the next part of your chapter, which is the last, before the conclusion, discusses some of the First Amendment issues related to this, which is something I had not really thought about before. So I'm wondering if you can tell me a little bit about that and explain how that kind of works into the antitrust analysis of privacy.
Yeah, that's a good, when we're talking about the reason antitrust the reason First Amendment issues could come up in this setting, and I'm not saying it would. I'm kind of playing the role of a law professor, posing some hypotheticals out there. But, antitrust has long been concerned with the First Amendment. I mean, there's been interactions between the two. I mean, you think about the Noor-Pennington doctrine is all about where competition butts up against First Amendment rights to petition. I petitioning government to screw my competitor over. I'm going to court to try to screw my competitor over. Well, those are First Amendment protected activities. And the Supreme Court has interpreted. They've never directly limited the antitrust laws based on the First Amendment. They said, we're going to interpret the Sherman Act in light of First Amendment principles to avoid a conflict, kind of a canon of construction, essentially. That's where Noor-Pennington doctrine has come from. So what I'm thinking about here is, you imagine whether it's the merger or the unilateral conduct case or whatever it is. And at the end of the day, you've got a remedy. You've got to have a remedy. And that remedy is going to say, if we're concerned, if the anti-competitive harm that we're concerned about here, if what we're concerned about is that you're merging two data sets, or you're taking too much consumer data that's causing harm, and then our remedy's going to be, well, let's say that your firms are merging, but you're not allowed to. We think that you compete on privacy, and we're worried that if you get together that you're going to take too much data. So we're going to say that you're not allowed to merge your data sets, or you're not allowed to engage in targeted ads, or some type of order like that. You could imagine a conduct order, whether it's a consent decree with an agency, or whether it's an order from a private suit. It could butt up against the First Amendment, and there's precedent for this in National Society of Professional Engineers, and which is famously known for other, the idea that we talked about early, that antitrust laws are about competition. That's the goal of antitrust laws, not these other society. It's not designed to go after other societal problems. That's a legislative function, not really necessarily a function for antitrust. But on remand, part of the order that the DOJ had to the engineers, it was going to force them to add. It was basically going to force them to put certain things into their canon of ethics, or to their guidebook, and the not the Supreme Court, I'm sorry, and remand, the DC Circuit, when they were looking at the order, said, okay, we're going to strike part of this order because it's butting up against the First Amendment rights of the engineers to speak. You're actually forcing them to speak, what telling them. And so the First Amendment not only prohibits limiting speech, it also prohibits forced speech, which is kind of an analog. I mean, the government can't limit your ability to speak, and actually can't make you say what they want you to say. There's complicated case law on this. So there certainly is precedent for that. And so you could imagine a situation where an agency or a court enters an order that limits the ability of a firm or merging firms to use certain data that could butt up against, that could be a burden on commercial speech. There's a commercial speech doctrine, and there are some appeals court cases that talk about gathering data for advertising, and then there's a 10th Circuit case on dealing with FCC privacy that suggests that that's potentially an issue. And then you could imagine maybe even directly, whether it's burdening commercial speech rights, or there's a fairly recent Supreme Court case dealing with state restrictions on the ability of pharmaceutical companies to gather data on prescribing habits of certain doctors and pharmacy from certain doctors in order to market. And that was not decided as a commercial speech case. It was actually decided as content-based and speaker-based discrimination. But there's dicta in there, and again, it's just dicta. But the Supreme Court says, that look, essentially says that if you limit, like speaking requires observing and requires data. So if you limit the ability to actually gather data, then you're actually hindering the ability to speak. Mm-hmm. And so there is at least, again, I'm playing law professor here. I'm putting out a hypothetical. I'm not saying that, hey, if this were ever to come to pass, if there ever were to be an antitrust order that restricted the ability of firms to gather data, that it's going to be doomed because of First Amendment. I don't know how it would play out. It's just to kind of highlight that and note that is a potential, another potential threat point to something like this, to a theory like this.
Understood. That would certainly be another interesting area where the antitrust laws and the First Amendment maybe come close without contacting. So I guess to wrap this up here, for anyone interested in learning more about kind of the intersection of privacy and antitrust, do you have any other articles that you would recommend that they read, or books about the topic?
The one I would say, I mentioned before the Doug Smith and Dan O'Brien paper. It's technical, so for lawyers watching this, there's a lot of math in it, but it's fairly readable, and it makes some good points. For economists, I would take a look. Doug Smith and Dan O'Brien, both Dan O'Brien since left the FTC, and he's in the private sector, but they have an FTC working paper. It's called Privacy in Online Markets. A welfare analysis of demand rotations. Now, not the sexiest title, but it really is I really like the paper a lot. I think it's good. I think for a general overview of some of the issues in privacy in general, I would highly recommend there in the Journal of Economic Literature, and I think it's 2018. It's The Economics of Privacy, and it's a great paper that gets into. It's by Alessandro Acquisti, Curtis Taylor, and Liad Wagman, and that's I would definitely recommend that. Again, it's not directly related to the antitrust and privacy, but it is a good overview of all the empirical and theoretical work that's been done in the economics and privacy, dating back really to the late 1970s with people like Posner. So there's a long history of economics and privacy going together.
Got it. And then for the more offbeat question at the end, last time I talked to John about what books he's been reading during this. And so for you, I will ask, what music have you been listening through to get through this fun stay-at-home time? As you can tell from our lovely at-home and virtual backgrounds.
Yes, yes, yeah. Yeah, I've been, I think, I don't know if it's just comfort or longing for simpler times. I found myself going back to some of the stuff I was listening to back in high school when I was coming up. So I've really been listening to Life Search Pageant by REM. That's one of my favorite, and it was right before REM kind of broke big. It was their Life Search Pageant was probably their last real indie album, and I got to see them in college, 1986, doing Life's Rich Pageant, and so I've been listening a lot to that. Been listening to Soul Mining by so kind of going back to 80s alternative stuff, and of course, I can't stray too far from from Luna. I've been listening. Luna is one of my favorite. They're an indie band, New York City indie band, now based most kind of all over, and I've seen them a million times in concert. I've been listening. I got Apple Music over the quarantine, so I've access to like these huge catalogs of B-sides. So I've been listening to some interesting B-sides. Cover by a Velvet Underground song by Luna, which often sounds like, not surprising because they sound a lot like kind of a Velvet Underground-y band anyway. Lonesome Cowboy Bill is kind of a chestnut from the Velvet Underground, and they covered it, and it's a fantastic cover. So I recommend you hear them both. It's one of the rare times I think I like the cover more than I like the original. No offense to Lou Reed. The final thing, and you kind of got me started on music, and Matt and I often talk about music, so it's kind of great. We could do a podcast on music, but
do it.
and this is kind of a shout out. It fits in. It's a shout out to data, to the use of consumer data, I think. So I also listen to Spotify too, but the commercial version, not the free version, because I'm cheap. I will pay for one platform. I'll pay for Apple Music. I'm not going to pay for Spotify. And I was listening to Spotify, just had it on, and they kind of serve you some different music comes up that suggested, and I found this really cool song by a band I'd never heard of before called The OCs. And they've been around apparently for a while, but it's a song called Minotaur, and it's got a very Pixies kind of vibe to it. So I'm going to plug them. Hopefully anyone listening to this will go out and download their song Minotaur. It's become over one of my favorite songs. It's always on my running playlist. So when I think about the quarantine, I will always think about Minotaur, because I've really gotten more into running and running through the alleys of Del Rey to avoid people, and listening to Minotaur and Life's Rich Pageant. So that's been my quarantine.
Well, love the Athens, Georgia shout out there for REM. So with that, I think we can wrap this up. Thanks so much for talking with me today, and I recommend everyone read your chapter when the report comes out this fall.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Matt. This has been a pleasure. Absolutely.